Well, the New York Times is taking a look at the United States' new political fault line. It's the rural-urban divide, and the article lays out how Democrats have blamed the Senate, Electoral College, and gerrymandering for their structural electoral disadvantages. But analysis actually suggests that their problems may actually run even deeper. Joining me now, the writer behind that article, Emily Badger. She covers cities and urban policy for the New York Times, and she joins us now from Washington. Emily, I have to say, this was such a fascinating read. Can you just explain to us why this problem is really leaving a deeper disadvantage for Democrats?
So urban-rural polarization is this thing that's been getting substantially worse in America over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, such that, where you live, whether you live in a city or if you live in a rural community, that predicts how you are likely to vote in a way that is much more true today than it was 50 years ago. And, this is a problem that a lot of people are familiar with in the Senate. City dwellers, Democrats who are more likely to live in cities, are structurally disadvantaged in the Senate. They're structurally disadvantaged in the Electoral College. But there's this much more kind of fundamental problem that the Democratic Party has with geography, which is that because they cluster all of their voters in this small number of places, that means that they effectively waste lots of votes. And, over and over again in elections for the House of Representatives, they're just disadvantaged in states all over the country. This is true in state houses, state legislatures too, such that Republicans are effectively distributed more evenly across the country. And we have this system of representation in the United States that rewards evenly distributing your voters.
So you talk about this uneven distribution. Why do you think it is that folks are focusing on this divide now when the Senate and the Electoral College have really been set up for decades this way?
Well, for starters, it's definitely getting worse. Donald Trump won 10% of voters in Manhattan. He won 4% of voters in Washington, D.C. We saw very similar patterns in major cities all across the country in 2016, where, the Republican nominee won a smaller share of voters in urban areas than we have ever seen before. Hillary Clinton won a smaller share of voters in many rural communities than we have ever seen before. So this pattern is growing worse, but I think it's also becoming a lot more evident to people, particularly on the left, that these patterns have kind of real consequences that matter a lot to people. We're in this situation right now, for instance, where a president who did not win a majority of the votes nominates 2 Supreme Court justices who were confirmed by senators who don't represent a majority of the population. And so, a lot of urban dwellers, a lot of Democratic voters are looking at that system and saying, how do we keep winding up with such non-majoritarian outcomes? And, this urban-rural polarization is really at the root of that.
What also struck us about this article, Emily, was this isn't just an American thing. According to your reporting, you're saying that this divide is also impacting forms of government in European countries. Can you explain exactly why that is?
Sure. So it's true in lots of different democracies that the left is clustered in cities and the right, the more conservative party, tends to be dominating more in rural areas. And that's true for a whole host of reasons. It has to do with, the knowledge economy in cities is sort of overwhelmingly supported by the Democratic Party. It's true because there's this long history of labor parties in cities that have grown up sort of where factories and workers and unions have existed in the past. So we see this in lots of other countries, but in a lot of other countries, it doesn't produce quite the same outcome that we have here, where the party of the left is just structurally disadvantaged in so many different ways, such that, even when they win a majority of the votes, they're not likely to hold a majority of the power. Mm-hmm. So even in a lot of European countries where we see this sort of urban-rural continuum of who's on the left and who's on the right, that doesn't necessarily mean that the party on the left is constantly blocked from holding power, even when they win a majority of the votes.
Mm. There's an opinion piece in The Week, and it says that, there's a way that Democrats can actually win rural voters. You got to do 3 things. The first is they need to recognize that rural voters are actually worth more than urban voters, and you got to spend time with them to win them over. The second thing they say is you got to break down rural media monopoly, which is dominated by Sinclair and Fox News. And the third, they've got to consider splitting the party into 2 to appeal to both rural and then also a separate camp to appeal to sort of urban voters separately. I'm curious, you've looked into this, you've reported on this. What's your take on this assessment?
Well, I think if you're a Democratic Party strategist, I don't think it's smart for you to clearly be ignoring rural voters, to give up on them in quite the same way that the Republican Party has very clearly given up on urban voters. But the reality of the electoral map when we look at it is that, you're probably going to pick up more ground trying to target suburban communities that lean slightly to the right, as opposed to trying to pick up rural communities that may have voted for Donald Trump or for past Republican candidates for president by 20 to 30 points. I mean, the reality of the political map in America right now is that Democrats are clustered in cities, Republicans are clustered in rural areas, and then we have this sort of great suburban middle ground between the two of them that the two parties have been fighting over for many cycles now. And, if you're a Democratic Party official and you're trying to figure out how are we going to win the House, how are we going to win the presidency, I think it's probably a lot more fruitful for you to figure out how to pick off precisely some of the kind of, modestly conservative suburban districts that the Democratic Party picked up in the 2018 midterm election.
And I guess that's exactly what it comes down to, Emily. How do we win the presidency, regardless of what party or camp you support? We'll be talking a lot about this in the next 18 months. I want to thank you very much for your reporting. It was a fascinating look at this fault line. Emily Badger with the New York Times.